This is a video about how to study. It's going to be a little bit of a different video from my usual ones because I'm just going to be sitting here talking and it's going to be probably a lot longer. Learning and studying are lifelong skills that would be really valuable to have, whether you want to continue on after the arborist exam and get other credentials and qualifications, or if you plan to switch industries and you want to progress. The skill of studying is going to be fundamental to all of that. This is based on my experience, lifelong learning, 30 something years, both in academic settings as well as self guided learning, both when I was young and now as an adult, where learning is much harder because you don't have the structure that you may have expected in college. Now, the only deadline you might actually have is just the arborist exam date. I did find a resource from a university that I'll link in the description, and it corroborates a lot of these steps. First, I want to start off with what I call fundamentals foundation, which is reasons and approaches that are personal to you. Number one, identify your purpose or your goal. In this case, you can put it within the context of the arborist test. Are you taking this test just so that you can get your certified arborist and have bragging rights or something like that? Are you trying to get more money after getting your certification? Are you trying to advance your knowledge? Hopefully build a foundation that you can learn more in the future. I would recommend that you identify reasons that are personal to you. I've certainly wanted to learn for other people. For example, right now I'm relearning Chinese. Initially, my reason was to learn it to practice with one of my nieces, but now it's about regaining a part of my life that I had put on pause for a long time. And the reason why picking a goal that's personal to you and focuses on you is more important is because it'll be more sustainable. You can only do something for someone else for so long before you burn out. And based on this purpose and goal, you can figure out what a good study timeline and what a good study approach is like for yourself. So if you want to really gain a lot of knowledge, then plan on a very long-term study, maybe at least 2 years. And this is something that you can start doing even before you qualify to sit for the certified arborist test. And what that does is it will refresh the information in your mind over and over so that it gets cemented very well. Whereas if you're someone who just wants to pass the test and you don't have any goals beyond that, then you could just get through with cramming. So minimize the amount of time you have available, stick to rote memorization, basically just memorizing definitions and concepts. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to understand these things. Most likely, afterwards, you're going to forget everything. And that is honestly how I learned through a lot of college, just memorizing and forgetting. The second step in this foundational section is to identify your learning style. And this goes even if you've been an academic in the past. When I was in college, I don't recall there being a lot of resources like videos on YouTube, definitely not podcasts. It was all about going to class, attending lectures, and reading the textbook. Nowadays, it's very different. You may not necessarily have a podcast that covers everything in the study guide, but you have more audiobooks and audio resources. You have PowerPoint presentations, videos that you can watch on YouTube, and those come in different formats. They can be lecture style, like the PowerPoints, or they can be more like the videos that I've been trying to create, where it's not so much lecture, it's a lot more visual. Even if you are someone who learns best from reading, I would still suggest that you find a variety of different resources, because sometimes being able to hear the terms, hear descriptions will also help that set in more. So if you're not sure about yourself, then I would recommend that you try a whole bunch of different things. And depending on what you're studying, it's going to vary as well. Studying language versus studying science, I myself have different approaches. If you are someone who likes to get advice from people, you're crowdsourcing opinions, people will say, hey, I read this book X number of times, I did this. And if you just try to copy their study habits, it may not necessarily work for you. This is the way that you set up a study approach that's much more tailored to your needs. And the third part of this is to identify your framework. We all have things that we already know and that we're interested in. So try to find things that are related to the arborist test. If you are a gardener, or if you're someone who's really interested in plants, this is very easy because trees are just one step away from other plants. If you love animals, you could think about trees being habitat. Understanding their habitat will connect to the animals themselves. If you're already working in the industry, whether as a salesperson, as a tree worker, if you can connect everything back to what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, it will again help things stick a lot better. I find that when I have a framework for information to stick to, not only do I retain the information more quickly, but I can also use that to actively practice the information as I'm learning. That's going to come in the next section, which is more of the how-tos. So the first step is plan your study sessions. You have to plan within what makes sense for you. You want to spread your learning over a long period of time instead of cramming everything in at once, because you're not going to be able to retain that information quite as well. If your sessions are shorter and they keep recurring for a long period of time, it's going to add up to a lot of learning. And I would say be realistic about this. If you know that your attention span is 15 minutes long, in this day of shorts and TikToks and things like that, or if you're so busy that you can only afford 10, 15 minutes, use that. Because if you try to push it and you say, I'm going to study for 20 minutes a day, you're going to start failing right away and it's not going to feel good. But if you aim for something lower and you hit 15 minutes a day for 10 days, that's 150 minutes already. And that adds up over time. What you can also decide is, does it make more sense for me to carve out a time of day, a specific time of that day, or do I just want to have flexibility as to when I do it? If you have flexibility, you can work around things. Maybe you want to sleep in a little bit. That's all good for your personal self, but you do have to have a little bit more discipline with that approach. If you are someone who has difficulty getting motivated to do something like that, there's this concept of body doubling. And I used to do this without knowing what the term was. But I would meet up with friends to study together or to do homework together, even though we weren't in the same class. It's helpful to know that someone is doing it at the exact same time as you. So if you have someone who is also studying for this test or studying for something else, even if, let's say, you have a kid and they have homework, you could be doing that at the same time as them, is just one extra way of holding yourself accountable. For me, I have found that in terms of reading books related to the industry or related to my job, maybe I've got 25 minutes a day in me. I mentioned that I was studying Chinese, 15 minutes a day. And if you aren't able to do it every day, don't be hard on yourself, knowing that you can only do 15 minutes at a time. Don't try to make up 30 minutes the next time if you miss one session. Just start over and continue on. But the continuing on is the most important part. The next step that I suggest here is to gather resources for a particular topic once you start working on it. And this can be all kinds of resources, videos, audios, different textbooks, things like that, because the idea is for you to be able to repeat this over and over and in slightly different ways so it fixes itself a little bit more. If you want to do this ahead of time, you can also organize it by topic. So here's an example. Let's say I'm learning the term xylem and phloem. What I will do is start reading about it, usually in the best resource I have. So this plant biology book, I'll start reading about the xylem and phloem in here. And then I have an idea of how they're explaining things. Then I will just read xylem and phloem only in this book. And then I just keep going through all my books. Again, I don't expect you to have all these books because they are very expensive. I use it for my work and I've slowly purchased textbooks and books over the years. But if your employer has a library or you have access to any kind of library, that would be a good resource. Whether you realize it or not, there are bad writers out there. There are some very like poorly written texts, and you won't know that until you get to compare it to another book and you find out that that book is actually much better written. For those of you who are studying for the test but have never done tree work, you don't know anything about ropes, cuts, things like that, it's going to be really hard to learn that just from the study guide or just from reading a book. So this is a sort of situation where it's really important to bring on that additional resource like videos. When I was studying, I believe I used the climbing arborist videos. There's different knots, there's different, tree work aspects, and that's how you can become more familiar with something instead of trying to imagine what that might look like from reading a book. This next step is basically the entirety of the studying process. The overall tip is to engage in what's called active learning and not passive learning. So passive would be something like, I have a book, my eyes, I have 15 minutes of studying. All I'm doing is running my eyes through this text, and that's it. That's very passive. Or I can come in and, highlight and mark stuff up, but I'm just underlining and highlighting, and I'm just not really using a lot of thought there. I'm just highlighting everything I don't know. The issue with that is once you highlight everything, none of it stands out. Part of active learning is also what I had mentioned, which is repetition. When I was in the more effective learning stages of my college career, this is what I would do. I also actively do this for every single video that I put together. Before a class, I would read the books that are relevant to that section. And then I would, on my initial read, I would write some notes. I would highlight little things, and that was it. So if you own your book, I really do recommend writing in it. It really helps. But I wouldn't focus on copying anything down because that interferes with you just looking through all the texts. So that's what's called previewing. So preview the stuff first, do a quick read, do some quick markups, and then I would come through again and actually take notes. So this is what that will look like. I'll write down a whole bunch of notes specifically to reinforce concepts that I'm not completely sure about, to write down definitions of new things I don't know. And this is what I will use to study later. And later, as I'm actually studying, I'm focusing on stuff that I don't know very well. And after I run through my notes and try to learn these, then I test myself. And you can test yourself with all the different questions that are available both in the study guide, at the end of book chapters if you have them. There's some practice tests online. That's a way to check how well you understand the information. As part of this active learning process, you can also engage in practicing the information and teaching it. So practice might look a little bit like using this information to talk to your coworkers or clients, or talking to yourself, just rehearsing the information, trying to phrase it in different ways to make sure that you truly understand the concepts. If you can only explain it in your mind, then you don't truly know it. It's when you try to verbally explain it that you find out the gaps that are in your true understanding. If you aren't sure about some of the things that you're learning, talk to someone that you think might know. But it's also good to just do some research on your own, because I will admit that a lot of these things, if it's been a while since someone passed their test, chances are fairly high that they have forgotten the details of what you're learning. Especially something like tree biology, it's good to have that knowledge as a foundation, but you don't necessarily bring in all the details while you're working as an arborist. For the teaching part of it, this is probably one of the more helpful things. If possible, teach someone. You're studying with someone, you could make a plan to teach each other certain concepts, because when you are learning something with the knowledge that you have to teach someone, it's going to make it fix that much harder. When I was in graduate school, I was expected to know all the material ahead of time, even though I may not necessarily have taken that class before. But you learn to learn the material just one step ahead of the students so that you can teach that to them, and then you continue on and on and on. And I ended up taking this approach in some of the classes that I was still taking as part of my degree, and I would be able to basically teach a class that I was in at that time. So it's all about the mindset. When you know that you have to teach someone, you're going to learn it that much better. And if you don't have someone to actively teach, even just having that mindset is good enough. You can teach aloud to yourself. But you may be surprised that there will be a lot of opportunities, like your clients, other tree workers, people in your life, community groups. Just look for those opportunities. And the last broad step that I have is to allocate your study time to things that are both important and that you don't know yet. And this is a tricky balance because these are things that are going to be at odds with one another. Realistically, unless you're gonna become a teacher, you don't need to know everything in the study guide perfectly. If you're a tree worker, chances are there's a lot of things that you're not going to need to know now. For example, the trees and construction chapter, probably won't be using that anytime soon. Or if you're someone who works in nonprofit tree organizations, when would you ever need the tree worker part? So you do still need to learn enough to pass the test, but you can focus more on the areas of information that you expect to use regularly, because you will have opportunities to practice and to learn more actively too. If you know that you're going to need the information in the near future, your motivation to study that material and to really learn it is going to be much higher. The devil's advocate position here is that this arborist test is probably going to be the only opportunity that most arborists have to learn the broad range of everything related to being an arborist. Even if you think that you won't need it now, if you have time, I recommend spending the time to learn it well so that you have a really good foundation in the future. One of my former coworkers, he was not ever interested in becoming an arborist, but he had to get the credential to become a estimator or a salesperson. And 5 years after that, now he's suddenly interested in consulting. And as part of consulting, there's a lot of construction involved. So it would have behooved him to really learn that chapter as well, even if he couldn't foresee it in his future. Even if you learn and forget, there will still be like a ghost of that information in your brain, so that if you ever need to review it and relearn it in the future, it becomes a lot easier. So these videos, for example, they're a lot of work, but I've read this book and many other textbooks during college multiple times. So I'm learning now, but there's a lot of it that's review, and things stick way faster this time around. Also, within using your time and energy efficiently, if you already know a concept or a term, drop it from your regular review. If you have flashcards, for example, it's very easy to just keep all your flashcards together and just review every single word that comes through, even if you already know it. But if you know exactly what mycorrhizae is, or you know exactly what different types of plant cells are, you're just wasting your time rehashing that information. Maybe periodically you do a run through of all the terms. That would be a good time to review it, but there's no point in reviewing a term over and over and using that little bit of brain energy when you could be spending that on stuff that you don't know yet. So to finally wrap up this video, I think that having patience for yourself, learning your learning style now as an adult is going to be really important, because sometimes we don't get to explore that when we're younger. We're expected to learn in a very specific way, and that way doesn't work if you don't have the same rigidity around you. I hope this was helpful. I have some other ideas for improving the learning or the comprehension that I have for my videos, And once that's ready, I will share them. If they don't get shared, then just know that my attention span probably just didn't match my ambitions or something like that.